So in this video, we're going to review project 6, where we see some examples of how we can loop through a string character by character. In this case, we're going to do some password checking and encryption as our example. So for this project, we're going to create a Java class called secrets, and we have some preliminaries. We're going to add a comment at the top of our code, which we always should do. And then we're going to create two constants. One will hold a value that we'll use to check that the password is correct after we convert the password to an integer. And the second is a shift value. We'll use that for our encryption. So then we have two actual parts of the project. The first is we're going to hash a password. The concept of hashing is we take a string and we convert that to some sort of value. In our case, it'll be an integer, although it could be another string. But that conversion is a one-way street. We can go from the string to our hash, but it's hard to go from the hash back to the string. And that's something that gets done in practice when you're storing a password. You don't want to store the password, and really you don't even want to store the encrypted password. You want to store some sort of hash that you can, once you have the password, compute that hash and compare that entered password's hash to the hash that's stored, and that will tell you that the password is correct. And then in part 2, we're going to use one of the simplest forms of encryption called the Caesar cipher, where we shift every character in the string by a constant amount. Now, this is a very easy encryption to decipher once you understand how to do that. So it's not a secure encryption. However, while both the hashing and encryption that we do in this assignment are simple, the concepts behind them do apply to more advanced, useful techniques that you would see later on. However, our focus is working with strings more so than cybersecurity. So these will prove to be acceptable options for our assignment. So here I have my empty class for this project, and I called it secret, as was, or actually it should be secrets. That's what the assignment says. So I'll rename the file as well because that has to be the same name as the class. So the first part was to add a comment, and I'll just put that it's the solution, and I'll put the date in the class section. Obviously, for your solution, you would have more specific stuff there. So then we want to create some password constants. So we'll say we'll have a final int password hash, which will be 883, and a shift that will be value 12. So that takes care of items 2 and 3 in the project. The next part is we need to prompt the user for a password. That's going to require a scanner, and we'll need to import scanner. Then we'll prompt the user, and the password is just going to be one word. So I guess we'll disallow spaces, and we'll just say that the password is going to be whatever the next return value is. And let's just test that this works. Now, this is not ideal. You would not want to have someone enter a password and then print out what they said. However, in this case, we're just testing that we got the correct value. And since that worked, we are reading the password. I would delete that line because obviously we don't want to display the password. So then we're going to add the individual characters of that password, and that's going to generate a hash. And so we'll start off with that hash value will just be 0. And then there's a couple ways we can do this. I'm going to use a for loop through the length of the string, and then I'm going to get a character one by one. So as I go through this loop, I'm moving through the string, getting each character at index II, whatever that current value is. Once I have that, I need to get the numeric value of that character. I'm going to say integer value is equal to, and there's a lot of ways to do this, but there's a value of that gives me the value of a particular entity. And so if I pass the character that I defined here to that, it'll give me the value. So I want to double check that that I did this correctly. So I'm going to print C is equal to C and val is equal to val. And this will let me know that I'm getting these values correctly. First, I'm getting each character, then I'm getting the integer value of that character. And so when I enter the password, I'll enter ABC123, and those look like the correct ASCII values. So I'm confident now that this procedure is giving me the correct values. So instead of actually getting the value and printing them out, I can actually just add these directly to the hash value. So now instead of printing those things out, I am adding them as we go. Now another thing you may notice, we don't really need this variable because whatever this is, we can use that here, and then this saves us a variable instantiation. Not a huge deal, but when you save up a little bit of time over and over, especially in a loop, it's amazing how that can impact execution time of your program. Okay, now we have the password hash. So let's print this out. I don't know why I keep writing colons instead of semicolons today. So if I run this and enter password, notice the hash is 883, and that's the one that I gave you originally saying that that would be equivalent. So it looks like this does work. So how can we tell if they printed the password or not? We've already converted the password to a hash. Now we're going to compare hash to expected value. So if hash is equal to password hash, we're going to print you entered the correct password. And then otherwise, we'll say that they entered an incorrect password. So let's test our code. Again, you should test regularly as you're writing your code. If I enter password, you entered the correct password. If I entered ABC or CD, incorrect password. So very good. So that completes part 1, which was number 5 of the project. Now we're going to encrypt a string. So we're going to create a simple Caesar cipher. And the way we're going to do that, and actually here we need to quit. So you were only supposed to do this if they had the password correct. So ask them to enter a sentence, and then that sentence will be, well, we already have a scanner, so we'll just use the one we had before, whatever they enter. And for now, to test our code, let's just print out that sentence. Again, this is just to test that we're reading that input correctly. So if we enter the password, it's going to ask us for a sentence, and you'll notice it already read that. And the reason is, when we read next, we're leaving that new line there. So I'm just going to call scanner next line so that I read the rest of that line of input, and then it resets us for when we read later. So password, enter a sentence to encrypt, and it looks like we're doing that correctly now. That cleaned up our output or our input. Now we can come back here to actually encrypt this. So I'm going to need an empty string for my encrypted sentence. And I also am going to be encrypting character by character. So I'm going to have a character here that I'm going to work with inside my loop. The loop is going to be similar to what I had before, except now it's going to be sentence length. And so the first thing I need to do is exactly what I did above. I need to get the integer value of the character. So I'm going to copy that down here because that was the same method calls I had before that I know work. And I'm going to put that in an integer. So, and you'll notice I'm using the same value or the same words, and that's okay because these are all in a different part of the code, so they're out of scope. So I guess I got rid of those before, but these names are all have local scope, so since I'm defining them in the loop, they're only valid in the loop. Okay, so now I've gotten the value here, and so what I need to do is add this character to my encrypted string. So right now that string is empty. So when I get the first instance of this loop, I'm going to look at the first character. What do I need to do with that? Well, I need to add the value plus the shift. However, value plus shift isn't going to quite get me what I need. That's an integer value. And so I need to convert that to a string. So if I say character to string, I can pass that value And you can see that the result is a string of length 1 consisting solely of the specified character, which in this case would be whatever the value of that was plus the shift. So to print the encrypted sentence, I'll change my output there. I can give it a sentence here, and I get an exception, string index out of range. This is what happens when you copy and paste things. Notice I'm doing password, and I need to do sentence here. So we got that fixed. Let's run it again. Password. When I enter that in, I get some junk. So that's that seems like it could be reasonable. One thing I like to do to double check that what I have is correct is that shift is 12. So if I enter A, B, C, D, and 1, 2, 3, 4, this should give me something consistent. So notice I get lowercase m and op, uppercase m and op. The space is consistent. I have a comma for each one, and then these characters. And that tells me that I'm shifting these consistently, so I can be sure that this is correct. And you'll notice it's a simple encryption mechanism, but it kind of gives you an idea of some of the techniques you would use. Obviously, if you want it to be more complicated, there would be more that you would do to encrypt this, but this kind of gives you a surface level, at least, example of that. So this is a sufficient solution for project 6, where we read in a password, check that password matches a predefined hash, and then we allow them to encrypt a string if they enter the correct password.